It was a little past midnight when Jack's radio crackled with the dispatcher's voice. "You're up, Jack. Passenger at 54th and Elm, heading out of town." Jack groaned. A quiet night had lulled him into a sense of ease, but this late call meant another hour before he could return home. As he turned onto Elm Street, he noticed how deserted it was. The streetlights flickered, casting strange shadows on the empty sidewalks. A lone figure stood near the corner, barely illuminated. They weren't waving, just standing still. Jack slowed his taxi, craning his neck to get a better look. The figure was a woman. She wore an old-fashioned dress, the kind you might see in a period drama. Long, dark, and flowing. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, with eyes that seemed too large for her delicate features. Something about her sent a chill crawling down Jack's spine, but he brushed it off. "Taxi?" she said, her voice soft yet clear over the hum of the engine. "Yeah, hop in," Jack replied, forcing a smile as he unlocked the doors. She slid into the back seat, moving with an eerie grace. "Where to?" he asked, adjusting his rearview mirror. She hesitated, her gaze fixed on something outside the window. "Maplewood Cemetery." Jack blinked. "The cemetery? At this hour?" Her lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes. Is that a problem?" Jack shook his head, muttering, "No problem," and pulled back onto the road. The soft click of the meter starting seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. As they drove, Jack couldn't shake the odd feeling in the car. The air felt heavier, colder, even though his heater was on full blast. The woman didn't say much, only giving occasional directions. Jack found himself glancing at her through the mirror, but each time her eyes would meet his, he quickly looked away. They passed through quieter streets, the city giving way to suburban stillness. The houses grew further apart, and soon, only trees lined the road. Jack's unease deepened when he noticed something odd. The same car had been following them for several miles. Its headlights were distant but steady, never closing in, never falling back. "You got someone tailing you?" Jack asked, trying to sound casual. The woman's expression didn't change. "Don't worry about it. Just keep driving." Her tone was calm, but something in it made Jack's stomach tighten. The trees thickened as they turned onto a narrow, unlit road. Jack's palms were sweaty against the wheel. "We're almost there, right?" he asked, his voice betraying his nerves. She didn't answer. Instead, Jack felt a strange sensation, a slight tug on the car, like something heavy had just joined them. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For a split second, it wasn't just the woman sitting in the back. There was someone, or something, else. Jack's heart raced as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. He glanced back again, but the rearview mirror only showed the woman, sitting calmly with her hands folded in her lap. His breath came in shallow gasps. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or fatigue. "Everything all right, driver?" she asked, her voice soft yet laced with something that sounded almost like amusement. "Yeah," Jack stammered. "Thought I saw something, that's all." She didn't respond, her gaze returning to the window. Jack's mind churned as he tried to rationalize what he'd seen. It was just a shadow, or maybe his imagination playing tricks. Still, the cold weight in his chest refused to lift. The road grew narrower, the trees on either side forming a dark tunnel. Jack noticed the headlights from the car behind them were gone. Relief flooded him for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by a deeper sense of dread. The night felt heavier now, the silence pressing against his ears. "We're close," she said suddenly, breaking the oppressive quiet. Jack almost jumped at the sound of her voice. All right," he muttered, his voice shaky. Moments later, the taxi emerged into a clearing. Ahead was a large wrought iron gate with a weathered sign hanging above it. Maplewood Cemetery. The iron bars were twisted and rusted, and beyond them, gravestones jutted out of the earth like crooked teeth. The woman leaned forward slightly, her face momentarily close to Jack's. "You can stop here." Jack braked, the gravel crunching under the tires. The engine hummed softly, the only sound in the stillness. The woman didn't move to get out. Here you go," Jack said, glancing at her through the mirror. She met his gaze, her pale face expressionless. "Do you believe in ghosts, Jack?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. The question sent a jolt through him. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice trembling. She smiled faintly, her eyes unreadable. "You told me," she said. But Jack hadn't. Before he could respond, she leaned back into the shadows of the seat. "Wait for me. I won't be long." Jack stared at her in disbelief. "Wait? Out here? Are you serious?" She opened the door without answering, stepping out with that same unnatural grace. Her figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness as she moved toward the gates, which creaked open without her touching them. Jack sat frozen, his fingers gripping the wheel. He glanced at the meter, still running. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but something held him in place. Minutes passed, then longer. The night stretched unbearably, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He reached for the door handle, intending to step out and call for her. But as he opened the door, a low, guttural sound came from the cemetery. It wasn't human. Jack froze halfway out of the taxi. The sound reverberated through the night, low and guttural, like a mix between a growl and a moan. He scanned the darkness beyond the cemetery gates, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through his chest. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice shaky and uncertain. No response. Jack sat back into his seat, slamming the door shut. His hand fumbled for his phone, but when he glanced at the screen, it was black. Dead, even though he'd charged it earlier. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he realized just how quiet it had become. Even the wind had stilled. The sound came again, this time louder, closer. He gripped the wheel and muttered under his breath, "Screw this. I'm leaving." He shifted the car into gear, but before he could press the accelerator, a soft knock came at the window. He jumped, nearly hitting his head on the roof. Turning, he saw her standing there, calm, composed, and eerily unbothered. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice serene but with an undertone that sent shivers down his spine. Jack rolled down the window slightly. "Just enough to talk. I thought something happened. You were gone so long." Her smile was faint but chilling. "I told you to wait." Without waiting for a response, she opened the back door and slid inside. As she settled into her seat, the air grew colder, almost icy. Jack could see his breath fogging up the windshield. "Take me home now," she said simply. Jack didn't argue. He pressed the accelerator, eager to put as much distance as possible between them and the cemetery. The car's headlights cut through the dense darkness as they drove, but Jack's nerves were shot. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified in the suffocating silence. "Where's home?" Jack asked, trying to sound casual. "Keep driving," she replied, her tone devoid of emotion. Jack's grip tightened on the wheel. The unease in his chest grew heavier with each passing minute. He glanced at her through the rearview mirror, and his stomach turned. She was staring at him, unblinking. But it wasn't just her eyes. There was something wrong with her reflection. Her face seemed off, distorted, as though the mirror couldn't quite capture her. Her features twisted subtly, her eyes darker than before, her mouth curling into a faint, unnatural grin. Jack's breathing quickened. He looked away, focusing on the road, but the urge to check again was overwhelming. He flicked his eyes back to the mirror, and the reflection was gone. "Something wrong, Jack?" Her voice was calm, but the way she said his name sent chills through him. "No," he lied, his voice barely audible. "Good," she said. He didn't dare look at her again. The silence in the car was unbearable. Jack's mind raced with every possibility, what he'd seen, what was happening, and why she seemed to know his name. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white, and focused on the road ahead. The highway stretched endlessly before them, flanked by tall, shadowy trees. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint ticking of the meter. Jack's pulse thudded in his ears, but he refused to glance at the mirror again. "Turn here," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the tense quiet. Jack flinched, startled. He hadn't seen any road or sign indicating a turn, but her command was firm. He hesitated. "Turn," she repeated, her voice sharper this time. Against his better judgment, Jack complied. The car veered onto a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for the taxi. Branches scraped against the sides like skeletal fingers clawing at the paint. "Where are we going?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "You'll see," she replied, her tone unnervingly calm. The road grew rougher, and the headlights illuminated nothing but the thick, encroaching forest. Jack's unease deepened as the path twisted and turned, leading them further into the unknown. Then, abruptly, the woman spoke again. "Stop here." Jack braked, the car jolting to a halt. He looked around. They were in a clearing, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to press inward. There was no sign of a house, no sign of civilization, just endless darkness. "This doesn't look like home," Jack said, his voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out, disappearing into the shadows without a word. Jack sat frozen, unsure of what to do. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but something held him there, a cold grip of fear and curiosity. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The oppressive silence bore down on him. Suddenly, there was movement in the trees, a rustling, faint at first but growing louder. Jack's heart pounded as he stared into the darkness, trying to make out what it was. Then he saw her. Or, at least, he thought it was her. She stood at the edge of the clearing, but something was wrong. Her figure was distorted, her limbs too long, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Time to go," she said, her voice echoing strangely, as though coming from multiple directions at once. Jack's blood ran cold. He slammed the car into reverse, his tires spinning on the loose dirt before catching traction. The woman, or whatever she was, watched him with that twisted, unnatural grin as the taxi sped backward onto the narrow path. As he tore down the dirt road, his headlights caught something in the distance. The same figure, standing still, waiting. "How is she?" Jack choked, slamming the brakes, but the figure vanished. And then, the knock came again, from the passenger side window. Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat. The knock was soft, deliberate, like someone testing his resolve. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at him to drive, he turned his head toward the passenger side window. She was there, but it wasn't the woman who had gotten into his taxi earlier. Not entirely. Her face was wrong, stretched, pale, and contorted into an inhuman grin that revealed too many teeth. Her eyes glowed faintly, cold and empty, as though they didn't belong to a living being. "Let me in, Jack," she said, her voice sickly sweet, dripping with malice. Jack's mind raced. He didn't know how she had gotten there or what she wanted, but every fiber of his being told him he was in danger. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the taxi lurched forward. He didn't dare look back. The trees blurred past as he sped down the dirt path, the headlights barely illuminating the way. His hand shook violently on the wheel. He muttered to himself, "Wake up, Jack. This isn't real. It can't be real." But then the voice came again. "Jack." It wasn't coming from outside this time. It was in the car. His blood turned to ice. He glanced at the rearview mirror, and his stomach dropped. She was sitting in the back seat again. "Where are you going?" she asked, her head tilting unnaturally as she smiled. Jack screamed, his voice raw and panicked. He swerved the car, nearly crashing into a tree before regaining control. His mind was in chaos, and his body was operating purely on adrenaline. Get out of my car!" he shouted, his voice cracking. She didn't respond. She just watched him, her smile growing wider, impossibly wide, until it stretched across her entire face. Jack slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, and he threw open the door. Stumbling out into the night, he turned to face the taxi, his heart hammering in his chest. The back seat was empty. For a brief moment, he thought he'd escaped. He thought it was over. But then he heard it. A soft, wet laugh, gurgling and broken, coming from behind him. He spun around, and there she was, standing mere inches away. Her eyes bore into his, and her mouth opened, impossibly wide, as if to swallow him whole. Jack stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his back, but he didn't care. He scrambled to his feet and ran, leaving the taxi, his phone, and everything else behind. The laughter followed him, echoing through the trees, growing louder and more distorted with every step. He didn't look back. He couldn't. When the authorities found Jack hours later, he was wandering a nearby highway, barefoot and babbling incoherently. The taxi was discovered abandoned in the clearing, the interior covered in strange, claw-like marks that couldn't be explained. Jack never drove again, and every time someone asked him what happened that night, he would only say one thing: she wasn't human.